So I would first of all like to start by thanking each and every one of you for taking the time to attend and to listen to the launch of our paper and the summary of the research and findings. In my presentation over the next 30 minutes, I don't propose to go into all the details of the study. I will only share the highlights, and of course, I'll be happy to take any questions on any part of the paper subsequent to that. Now, I think perhaps the best place to start is with an understanding of the process, or rather our system of parliamentary democracy. Now, at the core of government formation in our system of parliamentary democracy is the principle of confidence. The issue of the legislative body's confidence in either the Prime Minister or the Chief Minister is a condition precedent to her or his appointment as well as retention. The difficulty that we faced in Malaysia numerous times now, and I think more so in our recent past, is who decides on the issue of confidence? And should multiple political actors hold the power to decide? If so, how do they reconcile their respective positions? So these are the questions that are at the heart of this study. So this study was formulated through research on a number of case studies of government formation in Malaysia. I focused on 12 case studies, but there are of course numerous, and the selection of case study was also limited by the amount of information available. As you will see, one of the issues, of course, is the question of transparency. And because of that, there may be far more cases of disputes over appointments and dismissals of heads of government than we are actually aware of. So as you can see on this line, this horizontal line, I've tabulated the cases that I looked at, but in white are the cases that I did not look at, which are also significant. And it was simply a question of time that didn't allow me to look at all of the cases thoroughly. So understanding the purposes of the study, I think Thomas gave a very good introduction. But just if I may, to repeat some of what he said. So the primary objectives of this study are to examine the current process of government formation and whether it is reflective of the constitutional roles of the different political institutions and actors. Secondly, it is then to propose solutions to balance or rebalance, and also to actualize or realize the constitutional roles in a manner that also best serves our changing political structure. Now, this study does not propose and did not propose to make any changes or restrictions on the direct exercise by a head of state of his discretion in government formation. And this was because from the study, it was neither necessary nor practical or practicable to make such proposals. And those proposals could actually, in fact, be counterproductive. Because in the end, you do want perhaps some level of discretion to still be retained by the head of state. Now, I think the core issue here that came out very clearly in the study is that what requires regulation mainly is the relationship between the executive and the legislative branches. There's no doubt that there are contentious issues relating to a head of state scope of power, how they exercise the power, and whether in some cases they go too far. But as I'll return to later, the role of the head of state in government formation is actually a passive or reactive role, not a proactive role. In other words, the head of state can only exercise his discretion, his power in appointments and dismissals, when he is called upon by political circumstances to do so. And that is why, if it is possible for us to regulate the situations on which the head of state is called upon to exercise his discretion, we may not need to actually restrict or limit or regulate the discretion in itself. Now, the other point about the study is that it does not involve a critical assessment of the judicial decisions, or rather the judicial decision-making process. That is not the purpose of this study. I look at the cases that deal with government formation, the controversial ones. I talk about the principles that come out of those cases, but what we do not do is to give an opinion or a value judgment about whether it's correct or wrong. Right, so moving on now. So from the case studies that we looked at, these are, in summary, the number of issues or aspects of government formation that stood out very clearly. First one, a lack of standardization leading to differing outcomes. Now, the level of involvement of various heads of state across time and geographical regions, so that means national and subnational level, in determining questions of confidence has varied. Yeah, this is due largely to the freedom given to them to interpret both the type of evidence that they need to look at to determine confidence, but also the process that they adopt. Yeah, so because they are given so much leeway, what has happened over the course of time is that we have seen a lot of, or rather significant differences in the outcomes of very similar fact situations. Now, the other point that was also very clear is that the process of requiring or necessitating the legislature, the parliament or legislative assembly, to confirm or play a role in government formation was perhaps less material in a practical sense when we had the Grand Coalition or the dominant permanent coalition of Barisan Nasional. When Barisan Nasional basically was a one-party dominant coalition, essentially, up until 2018, and particularly at federal level, issues of power transitions were largely determined and agreed through its internal mechanisms. Yeah, and we've noticed that for all Barisan Nasional prime ministers until 2018, for all of them, the transfer of power occurred midway through an election cycle and fairly bloodlessly. So if there were any disputes, it was sorted out internally. It didn't really translate in a very obvious way in the formal appointment by the head of state. But things changed post-2008. So post-2008, the role of heads of state gradually expanded, largely to fill the void created by a collapsing Grand Coalition. So post-2008, heads of state increasingly asserted their authority to select heads of government and also to construe their power to act as primary, as the primary decision maker, even if options to return the mandate to the legislature go back to get a vote of confidence or even a vote of no confidence, or to dissolve the legislature, even if those options were available, heads of state took it upon themselves to make decisions about who should and should not be CM. Yeah, and subsequently, we saw in 2018 this situation escalate. Now, legislative ineffectiveness was likely both a driver for this as well as an outcome of royal overreach. Now, what's very clear from the case studies is that at no point were legislatures incentivized to embed confidence mechanisms that MPs or ADUNs could easily unlock in the event of a leadership crisis. Yeah, so I think there weren't any really legislatures that are certainly post-2008 that had set down very clear express confidence mechanisms or no confidence mechanisms in their rules. Yeah. So this is an example of state legislatures being disincentivized to strengthen their role in the process. As a consequence, reliance on the head of state's reserve of powers of appointment and dismissal became to be seen as the default method of resolving disputes over entitlements to govern. And the legislature's foundational role as the source of a head of government's legitimacy to govern was then never concretized, either institutionally, in other words, through laws and standing orders, but also behaviorally. So the political actors themselves did not see the DUNS or parliament as a legitimate or rather authoritative source in which to resolve leadership disputes. Instead, what we've seen over time is a body of precedents that have built up conferring wide discretionary powers on the constitutional head of state to appoint and remove prime ministers. Now, unlike a legislature, and this is perhaps some of the main issues with the current system, unlike a legislative body, there are no institutional mechanisms of transparency and accountability in how heads of state discharge their role. And the difficulty with that is that we cannot discount the fact that their exercise of discretion may be influenced or compromised either by friction with political actors, the political class, or through affinity with those competing for power. And because we cannot discount that possibility, the lack of transparency and accountability in how they make decisions, it's more acute. Now, finally, the case studies also clearly demonstrate that our political actors don't abide by a clear set of core principles or core protocols on the appointments and dismissals of government. And this is significantly different from the behavior of many other Westminster parliaments, which we have, now, Westminster parliaments are rely a lot on conventions, on constitutional conventions in their operations in order to effectively operate. And the difficulty in Malaysia is that many of those conventions are not codified. And when they are not codified, we do not see them translated into political behavior, into political custom. And as a result of this, what we have seen is acute instability as political competition increased post-2008 and grew more diverse post-2018. Right, so where does that leave us? So that is essentially the problem statement. What are the solutions? So in looking for solutions, we looked at how stable parliamentary democracies operate and perform and continue to be sustainable. And there are several factors that come out very clearly. Number one is that in these democracies that are stable and sustainable, what we find is that there are core principles and protocols of government formation that are embedded within the system. Now, these core principles circumscribe the conduct of other political actors in the process, and by doing so, they regulate the circumstances in which a head of state is called upon to exercise his or her discretion. Now, because these are principles and protocols, not all of them can be converted and made enforceable through law. So some of them operate, as I said earlier, through convention. And obviously, some of these principles need to be broad. You cannot capture them in specific form, whether in a constitution or in statutes. And of course, you can't potentially hope to cover every single permutation, every single type of political crisis that could arise. So some of these principles are covered in constitutional documents, in statutes and in parliamentary rules, but some of them are not. And in some countries like in the UK and New Zealand, where they don't have a written constitution, other forms of documentation is created, such as cabinet manuals. In terms of actual mechanisms that are used to then control the process of government formation, so the principles and protocols that I was talking about earlier, some of these can be protected through certain mechanisms in Parliament. These are the key mechanisms. One is obviously the confidence mechanism. And the confidence mechanism can be divided into two parts. One is an investiture vote, i.e. a vote requiring the Prime Minister, or rather a mechanism requiring the selected or appointed Prime Minister, or before he or she is appointed, to get a vote of confidence from the House. The other confidence mechanism, the other aspect of it, is the no confidence vote. And in many systems, you have both. The second area of control by Parliament over government formation is to regulate or control how Parliament is dissolved. Again, there are various ways of doing this. You can do it through fixed term laws. So Parliament is to sit for an X number of years, for example, before it can be dissolved. And there are certain very the Acts prescribe which situations Parliament can be dissolved early. But there are also, again, non-statutory political protocols. So again, looking now back at confidence mechanisms and explaining a little bit more, I won't go into too much detail on this, just to highlight some of the differences. So for an investiture vote, the purpose is to demonstrate and confirm legislative support. And investiture votes can be done in two ways. They can be formalized, so a codified investiture vote. In some countries, like Westminster parliaments, certain votes are considered to be like investiture votes, for example, the vote following the Agong's address or the Queen's speech. And failure to pass a vote, an investiture vote, could result in two things. Either Parliament gets dissolved, or there's an option perhaps of Parliament choosing an alternative head of government. With the no confidence procedure, there are two types of no confidence procedures. Yeah, first is just the regular no confidence procedure. A motion is put in to declare no confidence in the sitting PM. Yeah, there is also a special sort of no confidence procedure called the constructive vote of no confidence. Now, constructive vote of no confidence requires two parts. One is the regular no confidence vote, so you declare lack of confidence in someone, but that isn't enough. There must be an additional step of finding a replacement PM within that same process. And if a replacement PM cannot be found, then the incumbent usually retains the position. Yeah, the situation is slightly different in the UK, but we'll talk about that later. So how effective are investiture votes? So the case studies, or rather I should say the comparative studies that we looked at for this paper looks at the history of the investiture vote in parliamentary democracies in the West over an almost 200-year period. Yeah, and investiture procedures in the vast majority of countries has remained relatively stable over the course of time. What's also interesting is that the design of parliamentary investiture rules are not prescriptive. So they have been amended, they have been changed in order to suit or deal with issues that are specific to each political system. And the other issue of concern always is that if you have too many votes of confidence or no confidence on the floor of the House, you could lead to a unstable or you could destabilize government. But these studies found that that's not the case. The mere presence of an investiture vote does not have the effect of increasing the likelihood of minority governments. Yeah? What will have an impact perhaps is the sort of vote you need, whether you need a simple majority to pass an investiture vote or an absolute majority. So if we were then to look at how best to design an investiture vote, these would be the main components that we would look at, yeah, in taking into account the design. Whether the investiture is happening before formal appointment of a PM or after. What is being voted on? Is it directly the confidence in the PM, or the confidence in the government as a whole, for example? Is the vote only occurring in one house in parliament or in both houses? Whether you need a simple majority, so just the majority of MPs in the house at that particular time, or an absolute majority, which is 50% of all MPs plus one. Whether the vote is open or secret. Obviously, if it's an open vote, then that might limit how MPs who want to vote according to their conscience, yeah? And again, the consequences of failure. How many times do you get to put forward votes, investiture votes? Now, in terms of the no confidence procedure, similarly, the no confidence procedure, as I said, there's two kinds of regular confidence procedure and the constructive vote of no confidence. Obviously, when you have a constructive vote of no confidence, there's more restrictions placed on on parliament to replace government. And so in those cases, the procedure may seem more restrictive compared to countries where it's just a regular vote of no confidence. Yeah, but it's not always that simple. Sometimes it also depends on the other design elements, or rather the other procedural elements for the procedure as well, which will control how restricted for MPs to use. So once again, what are the key design components that we would be looking at if we wanted to develop this in Malaysia? Very similar to investiture vote. Yeah, I'll leave this up on screen for a while. I won't read it.